I stood in the doorway of what used to be my bedroom, watching my daughter-in-law Jessica hang her expensive curtains where my grandmother's quilt once draped the window. The mahogany dresser that held 60 years of memories had been replaced with some modern white monstrosity from a furniture catalog. Even the lavender walls I'd painted myself last spring were now a sterile beige that matched Jessica's cold personality perfectly. "Mom, you'll love the garage apartment," my son David called from behind me, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness he'd perfected since marrying her. "We've made it really cozy for you. It has its own entrance and everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Cozy." That's what they called the converted garage where they expected me to live while they took over the house I'd spent 43 years turning into a home. The house where I'd raised David as a single mother after his father walked out. The house where I'd worked double shifts as a hospital administrator to pay the mortgage, skipping vacations and new clothes so my son could have everything he needed. What David didn't know, what Jessica certainly didn't know, was that the eviction notice sitting in that garage apartment wasn't meant for me. It was addressed to them. Because while they'd been busy redecorating my life away, I'd been busy making some changes of my own. Legal changes, permanent changes. My name is Margaret, but everyone has always called me Maggie. At 72, I never imagined I'd be fighting for my dignity in my own home. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. For most of my adult life, I was the woman who held everything together. I was the one who remembered birthdays, organized family gatherings, and made sure everyone felt loved and included. I worked my way up from a secretary to the head administrator at Riverside General Hospital, a position I held for 25 years before retiring. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, especially as a woman in the 1980s when female executives were still rare. But my greatest pride was always David, my brilliant, ambitious son who graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern and landed a prestigious job at a marketing firm in Chicago. The house on Maple Street became mine in 1981, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch that I fell in love with the moment I saw it. The mortgage payments were steep for a single mother, but I was determined to give David stability. I painted every room myself, planted the garden that still blooms every spring, and created the kind of home where neighborhood kids knew they could always find fresh cookies and a listening ear. David thrived in that house. He brought friends home from school, hosted sleepovers in the finished basement, and spent countless hours at the kitchen table where I helped him with homework while balancing the checkbook. When he left for college, the house felt empty, but I filled the silence with volunteer work and friendships that sustained me through my 50s and into retirement. I thought I'd done everything right. I'd raised a good man who called every Sunday and visited for holidays. I'd built a comfortable life for myself with book clubs, garden societies, and a small but close circle of friends. When David announced his engagement to Jessica 3 years ago, I was overjoyed. Finally, he'd found someone to share his life with. And maybe, just maybe, I'd get the grandchildren I'd always dreamed of. Jessica seemed perfect on paper. She was 28 to David's 35, with an MBA from a prestigious university, and a job at a consulting firm that paid more than I'd ever made. She was polished, articulate, and undeniably beautiful with her perfectly straightened blonde hair and designer wardrobe. During their engagement, she was charming enough, though I noticed she had a way of steering conversations toward herself and her accomplishments. Their wedding was a lavish affair that cost more than my first car, held at an exclusive country club with 200 guests I didn't recognize. I wore the navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion and smiled proudly as my son promised to love and honor this woman who was about to become part of our small family. I genuinely hoped we'd grow close, that she'd become the daughter I'd never had. The first year of their marriage was relatively peaceful. They lived in David's downtown condo, and our relationship maintained its comfortable rhythm. Sunday phone. Calls continued. Holiday visits were pleasant, and Jessica seemed to be making an effort to include me in their life. She'd ask about my book club, comment on photos I'd share of my garden, and even suggested we go shopping together once or twice. But I started noticing small changes in David. He seemed more stressed during our conversations, more distant somehow. When I asked about work or their life together, his answers became shorter, less detailed. Jessica often hovered nearby during our phone calls, and I could hear her whispering corrections or suggestions about what he should tell me. Still, I told myself this was normal. Young couples needed time to establish their own traditions and ways of communicating. The shift became more obvious during their second year of marriage. David started canceling visits at the last minute, claiming work emergencies, or Jessica feeling under the weather. When they did come to the house, Jessica would spend most of the time on her phone or making comments about the outdated decor and old-fashioned furniture. She had a way of delivering criticism that sounded almost like concern, saying things like, "Oh, Maggie, you really should update this kitchen. It's so hard to cook in spaces that aren't functional." I began to feel self-conscious about my home for the first time in decades. The floral wallpaper I'd loved suddenly seemed dated when Jessica wrinkled her nose at it. The family photos covering the mantelpiece appeared cluttered when she suggested I streamline the space. Even my grandmother's china, which I'd always cherished, became so formal and impractical for modern entertaining, according to Jessica's well-meaning observations. David started echoing her sentiments, though more gently. He'd suggest that maybe it was time to refresh certain rooms, or that I might be more comfortable in a smaller space that required less maintenance. At first, I thought he was genuinely concerned about my ability to manage the house as I aged. The yard work was becoming more challenging, and the winters did feel longer than they used to. But then came the conversations about my future that felt less like concern and more like planning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David and Jessica would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking, and I'd catch fragments of whispered discussions about practicality and financial sense. Jessica began asking pointed questions about my retirement savings, my monthly expenses, and whether I'd ever considered downsizing to something more manageable. The pressure increased gradually, so subtly that I almost didn't recognize it as pressure at all. They'd visit and spend the entire time pointing out things that needed repair or updating. Jessica would sigh dramatically about the wasted space in the house and wonder aloud how much money I was throwing away on utilities and maintenance for rooms I barely used. David would nod along, adding that he worried about me rattling around in such a big house all alone. During one particularly uncomfortable visit last spring, Jessica suggested I consider moving into one of those lovely senior communities where I could have built-in social activities and professional maintenance staff. When I politely declined, explaining that I loved my home and my neighborhood, she exchanged another one of those looks with David. This time, I saw something in their expressions that made my stomach clench with unease. It wasn't concern I saw in their faces. It was calculation. They weren't worried about my happiness or well-being. They were frustrated that I wasn't cooperating with whatever plan they'd already made for my future. That night, after they left, I sat in my living room surrounded by 4 decades of memories and wondered when my son had stopped seeing this as his childhood home and started seeing it as his inheritance. The real wake-up call came during a family dinner at their condo 2 months later. We were discussing vacation plans when Jessica casually mentioned how nice it would be to have a proper house where they could host family gatherings and maybe even start a family of their own. She talked about wanting a big kitchen for entertaining and a yard where children could play safely. The way she described her dream home, with its period details and mature landscaping, sounded remarkably similar to my house on Maple Street. When I mentioned the similarities, Jessica laughed and said something about great minds thinking alike. But David looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and changing the subject quickly. As the evening progressed, I noticed they both seemed to be watching me carefully, as if measuring my reactions to their hints and suggestions. The drive home was quiet, but my mind was racing. I kept replaying conversations from the past several months, looking for clues I might have missed. The way Jessica's eyes lingered on my antique furniture when she thought I wasn't looking. The questions about my will and estate planning that David had been asking with increasing frequency. The suggestions about senior living that had become more persistent despite my clear lack of interest. By the time I pulled into my driveway that night, a terrible understanding was beginning to take shape. They didn't want me to downsize for my own good. They wanted me out of the house so they could move in. My beautiful home on Maple Street, with its established garden and vintage charm, was exactly what they'd been describing as their dream house. And apparently, they'd decided that dreams should become reality, sooner rather than later. I sat in my car for a long time that night, staring at the house I'd worked so hard to buy and maintain. The porch light I'd left on cast a warm glow over the front steps where David had learned to ride his bike, where I'd sat with him during thunderstorms when he was afraid, where we'd carved pumpkins every October and decorated for Christmas every December. This wasn't just my house. It was my life, my independence, my security. It was the place where I'd built my identity as a successful single mother and a strong, capable woman. The idea that my own son might be plotting to take that away from me felt like a betrayal so deep I could barely comprehend it. But even as the realization settled in my chest like a cold stone, another feeling began to emerge alongside the hurt. It wasn't anger exactly, though that would come later. It was something sharper and more focused. It was the recognition that, if David and Jessica thought they could manipulate me out of my own home, they had seriously underestimated the woman who had fought her way through 40 years of challenges to build this life. I had survived an abandoning husband, financial struggles, workplace discrimination, and every obstacle that had tried to knock me down. I had raised a son, built a career, and created a home through sheer determination and careful planning. If they thought I would simply roll over and hand them everything I'd worked for, they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. That night, I went inside and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad. I started making lists of everything I could remember about our recent conversations, every suggestion they'd made, every question about my finances and future plans. Patterns began to emerge that I'd been too trusting to see before. I also started thinking about my assets, my legal protections, and the documentation I had regarding the house and my other investments. I'd always been meticulous about record keeping, a habit from my administrative career that had served me well in retirement. As I reviewed what I knew about my own financial situation, I began to feel more confident. Whatever David and Jessica were planning, they were going to discover that moving me out of my own home wouldn't be as simple as they seemed to think. I hadn't spent 4 decades building this life just to hand it over to anyone, even my own son, without a fight. The real confrontation was still weeks away, but that night marked the beginning of my transformation from a trusting mother who wanted to believe the best about her family into a strategic woman who understood that sometimes the people you love most are the ones most likely to take advantage of your love. I went to bed that night with a new kind of clarity. I still loved David with all my heart, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own well-being for his comfort or convenience. If he and Jessica wanted a house like mine, they could buy one with their own money and their own effort, just like I had done 43 years ago. What I didn't know yet was just how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. But I was about to find out, and when I did, they would discover that the sweet, accommodating mother they thought they could manipulate had depths of strength and determination they'd never imagined. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning, in early October. I was in my garden covering the last of my tomato plants before the first frost when I heard the familiar ringtone from inside the house. By the time I reached the kitchen phone, Slightly out of breath and with dirt still under my fingernails, David was already speaking in that rushed, anxious tone he'd developed over the past year. "Mom, we need to talk. Can Jessica and I come over tonight? There's something important we need to discuss with you." His voice carried an urgency that made my stomach tighten, but underneath it, I detected something else. Relief, perhaps, as if he'd been rehearsing this conversation and was finally ready to deliver it. I agreed, of course, though every instinct I'd developed over 7 decades told me to be cautious. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day in an odd state of nervous energy, cleaning rooms that were already spotless and rearranging flowers that needed no attention. By evening, I'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a comfortable blue sweater and slacks that made me feel confident and dignified. They arrived precisely at 7, Jessica carrying a leather portfolio. That seemed far too formal for a family discussion. She was dressed as if she'd come straight from a business meeting, her hair pulled back in a severe bun and her expression unreadable. David looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes as I hugged him hello and offered them coffee. We settled in the living room, the same space where David had once sprawled on the carpet playing with toy trucks and later studied for his college entrance exams. Now he perched on the edge of the sofa like a stranger, while Jessica arranged papers from her portfolio with methodical precision on my coffee table. "Mom," David began, his voice carefully controlled, "we've been doing a lot of thinking about your situation here, and we're worried about you." Jessica nodded sympathetically, her manicured fingers tapping against one of the documents. "Maggie, we care about your well-being, and frankly, this house is becoming too much for you to handle alone. David and I have been researching options that would give you more security and less responsibility." I felt a familiar flash of irritation at being discussed as if I weren't sitting right there, capable of speaking for myself. "What kind of options?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. Jessica slid a glossy brochure across the table toward me. "Sunset Manor Assisted Living." It read in elegant script above photos of smiling, elderly people playing cards and tending small garden plots. "This facility is absolutely beautiful, and they have an opening in their independent living section. You'd have your own apartment, meals provided, activities, medical care on site. It's really the perfect solution." I picked up the brochure, noting the Madison address, 45 minutes away from everything and everyone I knew. The apartments shown in the photos were pleasant enough, but sterile in their uniformity. Each unit looked exactly like the next, with the same beige walls, standard furniture, and small windows that revealed carefully manicured but artificial-looking grounds. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not interested in assisted living. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own home, and I have no desire to move." David leaned forward, his expression a mixture of frustration and what I was beginning to recognize as rehearsed patience. "Mom, be realistic. When was the last time you cleaned those gutters? The furnace is at least 20 years old, the roof needs work, and don't even get me started on the electrical system. What happens when something major breaks down and you can't afford to fix it?" The condescension in his tone stung more than I expected. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to balance a checkbook and research major purchases carefully. He knew perfectly well that I'd been maintaining this house competently for 4 decades and had substantial savings specifically for repairs and maintenance. "David, I had the furnace serviced last month, and the electrical system was updated 8 years ago when I remodeled the kitchen. As for the roof, it's scheduled for replacement next spring, and yes, I can afford it." I kept my voice level, though inside I was seething at having to justify my competence to my own child. Jessica cleared her throat and pulled out another document. "Well, even if you can manage the physical maintenance, there's the financial aspect to consider. Property taxes keep going up. Utility costs are increasing and you're on a fixed income. Wouldn't it make more sense to liquidate this asset while the market is strong and move somewhere more affordable? There it was. The real reason for this intervention disguised as concern for my welfare. They wanted me to sell the house, and I had a strong suspicion about who they thought should benefit from that decision. Where exactly would I go that would be more affordable than a house I own outright? I asked. That's what makes Sunset Manor so perfect, Jessica replied smoothly. The monthly fees are quite reasonable, especially considering everything that's included. And once you sell this place, you'll have a nice nest egg to cover those costs and leave something substantial for David's future as well. David's future. Not my future, not my security, not my choice about how to spend my remaining years. His future. The mask was slipping, and I could see the calculation behind their concern more clearly with each passing minute. I need time to think about this, I said, gathering up their brochures and documents. This is a major decision, and I won't be rushed into anything. The look that passed between David and Jessica was brief but revealing. Impatience, frustration, and something that looked remarkably like irritation that I wasn't immediately agreeing to their plan. Of course, Mom, David said, though his smile seemed forced. But don't wait too long. The opening at Sunset Manor won't last forever, and the housing market could change. After they left, I sat in my kitchen with the assisted living brochures spread in front of me, feeling a deep sadness that had nothing to do with aging or loneliness. My son, the child I'd sacrificed everything to raise and educate, was actively trying to manipulate me out of my home. Not for my benefit, but for his own. The next few weeks brought a campaign of pressure that would have impressed any sales professional. David called daily with new concerns about my living situation. A neighbor's house had been broken into. Did I feel safe living alone? The winter was predicted to be harsh. Was I prepared for potential power outages? A woman in his office had fallen down her stairs. Shouldn't I be somewhere with easier access and help nearby? Jessica began forwarding me articles about the benefits of senior communities and the dangers of elderly people living independently. Stories about falls, medical emergencies, and financial scams targeting isolated seniors appeared in my email almost daily. Each message came with a note expressing her caring concern for my well-being and gentle suggestions that I reconsider their recommendation. They also started visiting more frequently, always with some new observation about the house's shortcomings. Jessica noticed a loose floorboard in the hallway and worried aloud about trip hazards. David expressed concern about the steepness of the stairs to the second floor and wondered if I should really be going up and down them multiple times a day. Even my beloved garden became a source of their anxiety, with Jessica suggesting that all that bending and lifting might be too strenuous for someone my age. What bothered me most wasn't their criticism of my home, but the way they spoke about me as if I were already incapacitated. They discussed my limitations and vulnerabilities in front of me like caregivers planning for a difficult patient. Jessica would ask David questions about my cognitive state and my physical capabilities, while I sat right there, perfectly able to answer for myself. I began to feel like I was being erased from my own life, reduced to a problem that needed solving rather than a person with her own thoughts, feelings, and preferences. The confident, capable woman who had managed a hospital department and raised a successful son was being recast as a frail, confused elderly lady who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner. I'd spent 3 days preparing David's favorite dishes, the same menu I'd been making for over 30 years. The turkey was perfectly golden. The stuffing was seasoned just the way he liked it. And I'd even made his childhood favorite, sweet potato casserole with marshmallows on top. Instead of appreciation, I got a lecture about the dangers of cooking large meals at my age. Jessica worried about burns from the oven, cuts from sharp knives, and the strain of being on my feet for hours. David suggested that next year, it might be safer for everyone if we celebrated at a restaurant, or if they hosted the meal at their condo. "This might be the last time you're able to handle such a big production," Jessica said, with what she probably thought was kindness. "It's nothing to be ashamed of. We all slow down eventually." I looked around my dining room, decorated with autumn leaves I'd collected from my own yard and set with my grandmother's china. This table had hosted David's birthday parties, graduation, celebrations, and countless ordinary dinners that had built the foundation of our relationship. Now Jessica was casually suggesting that my era as the family's host and caretaker was over. "I'm 72, not 92, I said sharply. "I'm perfectly capable of cooking a meal in my own kitchen." David sighed heavily, as if I were being unreasonably stubborn. "Mom, nobody's saying you can't cook. We're just worried about you taking on too much. What if something happened while you were here alone, dealing with hot ovens and all these dishes?" "Then I'd handle it, the same way I've been handling challenges for the past 43 years in this house," I replied. The remainder of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence, with Jessica picking at her food and David making occasional comments about how much easier next year would be if we simplified our holiday traditions. By the time they left, I felt emotionally exhausted and more alone than I'd been since my husband walked out decades earlier. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Helen in Phoenix. Helen was 5 years older than me and had moved to Arizona after her retirement to be closer to her daughter's family. We talked monthly, but usually kept our conversations light, sharing garden updates and grandchildren news without delving into serious family matters. This time was different. I found myself pouring out the whole story, describing David and Jessica's campaign to move me out of my home and their obvious desire to take over the property themselves. Helen listened without interruption, occasionally making sympathetic noises that told me she understood exactly what I was experiencing. "Maggie," she said when I finally finished, "you know what this is, don't you? This is elder abuse, emotional manipulation designed to separate you from your assets and your independence. Jim and I went through something similar with his brother a few years ago." Hearing it named so directly was like a slap of cold water. Elder abuse. I'd always associated that term with physical violence or outright theft by strangers or paid caregivers. I'd never considered that it could come from family members who claimed to love you, wrapped in expressions of care and concern. "What did you do about Jim's brother?" I asked. "We fought back," Helen said firmly. "We got a lawyer, documented everything, and made it clear that we wouldn't be pushed around. It saved Jim's sanity, and probably his life savings too. You need to do the same thing, Maggie. Don't let them guilt you into giving up everything you've worked for." After we hung up, I sat in my bedroom looking at the photo albums that chronicled David's childhood and my years of hard work building this life. Somewhere in those pages was the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and tell me I was the best mom in the world. That boy had grown into a man who apparently saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. The realization that my own son was systematically trying to manipulate me out of my home and independence was devastating, but it was also clarifying. I'd spent months making excuses for their behavior, telling myself they meant well even when their actions felt cruel. Now I could see the situation for what it really was. A calculated effort to separate me from my assets by making me believe I was incapable of managing my own life. Helen was right. This was abuse, and like any form of abuse, it would only escalate if I didn't take action to stop it. The question was what kind of action to take. I could confront them directly, demand that they back off and respect my choices. But I suspected that would only lead to more pressure, more manipulation, and possibly more aggressive tactics. Or I could be strategic. I could start gathering information, understanding my legal position, and preparing for whatever they might try next. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that David and Jessica had made a crucial mistake in their campaign against me. They'd assumed I was too old, too trusting, and too emotionally dependent on their approval to fight back effectively. But I wasn't just a doting mother who could be easily manipulated. I was also a retired hospital administrator who had spent decades managing complex budgets, navigating legal requirements, and dealing with people who underestimated my capabilities. I had skills they'd forgotten about, resources they didn't know existed, and a level of determination they'd apparently never witnessed. The next morning, I made my first strategic decision. I called my bank and made an appointment to review all my accounts and understand exactly what David had access to as my emergency contact, and what he didn't. I also scheduled a meeting with the lawyer who had handled my estate planning 5 years earlier to make sure all my legal documents were current and properly protected. As I hung up the phone after making these appointments, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of my own power. David and Jessica might think they were dealing with a confused old woman who could be pressured into abandoning her home and independence. They were about to discover they'd seriously miscalculated their opponent. I spent the rest of that day documenting every conversation, every pressure tactic, and every suggestion they'd made about my living situation. I printed out the emails Jessica had sent with articles about senior living and filed them alongside the brochures they'd brought to our meeting. I also started a journal where I recorded the dates and details of each interaction, creating a paper trail that would support my position if legal action became necessary. That evening, for the first time in weeks, I cooked myself a proper dinner and ate it in my dining room using my good china. I was celebrating, in a small way, the beginning of my resistance. David and Jessica had declared war on my independence, probably without even realizing that's what they were doing. But I understood exactly what was happening, and I was prepared to fight back with every tool at my disposal. They wanted my house, my financial security, and my autonomy. What they were going to get instead was a lesson in exactly how formidable a determined 72-year-old woman could be when her back was against the wall. The battle for my future was just beginning, and I intended to win it. The meeting with my attorney, Robert Chen, took place on a gray December morning that matched my mood perfectly. His office occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated Victorian, downtown, with tall windows that let in pale winter light and bookshelves lined with legal volumes that spoke of decades of experience. Robert had handled my will and estate planning when I retired, and I'd always appreciated his straightforward manner and attention to detail. "Margaret," he said after reviewing the documents I'd brought, "what you're describing is concerning. On several levels. Let me ask you directly. Do you have any cognitive impairment, memory issues, or physical limitations that would genuinely affect your ability to live independently?" I almost smiled at the bluntness of his question. Absolutely not. I balance my own checkbook, manage my medications, drive safely, cook for myself, and maintain my home. My last physical showed normal blood pressure, good cholesterol levels, and no signs of cognitive decline. Dr. Williams says I'm healthier than most people 20 years younger. Robert nodded, making notes in his precise handwriting. Then, what we're dealing with is attempted financial exploitation through emotional manipulation. It's more common than you might think, and unfortunately, adult children are often the perpetrators. Hearing a legal professional validate my growing suspicions was both relieving and heartbreaking. My son, the child I'd raised to be honest and compassionate, was following a playbook for elder abuse that apparently had recognizable patterns. "The question," Robert continued, "is what you want to do about it. We have several options, ranging from protective legal measures to direct confrontation. But first, I need to understand exactly what access David currently has to your finances and property." I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, containing copies of every financial document I could locate. Bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, and the deed to my house were all organized with the same attention to detail I'd used during my administrative career. Robert reviewed each document carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific accounts or decisions. Good news, he said finally. Your estate planning is solid, and David doesn't have any current legal access to your assets. He's listed as your emergency contact at the bank, but that doesn't give him authority to make transactions. The house is in your name alone, and your will clearly states your intentions for distribution of assets after your death. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. So they can't force me to sell the house or move into assisted living? Absolutely not. You're competent, you own the property outright, and you have every right to live there as long as you choose. However, he paused, studying my face carefully. I suspect they're going to escalate their pressure tactics when they realize gentle persuasion isn't working. Robert's prediction proved accurate sooner than I expected. The day after Christmas, David and Jessica arrived at my house unannounced, finding me in my kitchen putting away the dishes from my quiet holiday meal. I'd spent Christmas alone for the first time in decades, having declined their invitation to celebrate at their condo. The thought of enduring another session of criticism about my living situation disguised as holiday cheer had been more than I could bear. "Mom, we need to talk," David said without preamble, his usual polite greetings absent. Jessica stood beside him with her arms crossed, her expression colder than the winter air they'd brought in with them. "We've been patient with you," Jessica began before I could even offer them coffee. "But your stubbornness is becoming a real problem. David is worried sick about you living here alone, and frankly, so am I. This house is a death trap for someone your age." The bluntness of her attack caught me off guard. Gone was any pretense of caring concern or gentle suggestion. This was a direct assault on my judgment and autonomy. "Yesterday, David found out that Mrs. Patterson down the street fell and broke her hip," she continued. "She lay on her bathroom floor for 6 hours before anyone found her. Is that what you want to happen to you? Is that how you want David to find you someday?" David nodded grimly, though I noticed he couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Mom, we can't keep worrying about you like this. Every time the phone rings, I think it might be bad news. You're being selfish by putting us through this stress." Selfish. The word hit like a physical blow. After 40 years of putting David's needs before my own, after sacrificing vacations, new clothes, and countless personal desires to ensure he had everything he needed, I was being called selfish for wanting to remain in my own home. "I see," I said quietly. "And what exactly do you propose I do about this alleged selfishness?" Jessica pulled out her phone and showed me a screenshot of a real estate listing. "We've already been in touch with Linda Morrison at Premier Properties. She thinks your house could sell for at least $400,000, maybe more if we stage it properly. That would give you more than enough for the assisted living facility and leave a substantial amount for your future care needs." The casual way she mentioned having contacted a realtor without my knowledge or permission made my blood pressure spike. They'd actually begun the process of selling my house while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. "You contacted a realtor about my property without asking me?" I kept my voice level, though inside I was seething. David shifted uncomfortably. "We just wanted to get an idea of the market value, for planning purposes. We're not trying to pressure you, but we need to be realistic about your options." "My options?" I repeated. "These are decisions about my life, my home, and my future. When did they become our decisions to make?" Jessica's mask of patience finally slipped. Completely. "Look, Maggie, I know this is hard to accept, but you're not thinking clearly about this situation. David and I are young. We're starting our careers, and we need to plan for our future too. This house is just sitting here, taking up resources that could be put to better use." There it was. The truth they'd been dancing around for months, finally spoken out loud. They didn't want me in assisted living for my own good. They wanted me out of the house so they could have it for themselves. "Better use," I said slowly. "You mean better use by you and David?" "We're family," David said defensively. family, helps each other. You helped me through college, and now it's time for me to help you make smart decisions about your future. The manipulation was so blatant it was almost breathtaking. Helping me through college by taking my house and displacing me from my home was apparently the same as my working double shifts to pay his tuition and living expenses. "Get out," I said quietly. They both stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. I said, "Get out of my house. Now." "Mom, you're overreacting," David protested. "We're just trying to help you see reason." "The only thing I see clearly is that you've been planning to take my home away from me while pretending to care about my welfare. That's not help, David. That's manipulation. And I won't tolerate it in my own house." Jessica grabbed her purse with sharp, angry movements. "You're making a huge mistake, Maggie. This house is going to become a burden you can't handle, and when it does, don't expect us to bail you out." "I wouldn't dream of it," I replied. "I've been handling my own problems since before you were born, and I'll continue to do so long, after you've moved on to your next scheme." After they left, I sat in my living room shaking with anger and adrenaline. The confrontation I'd been dreading had finally happened, and surprisingly, I felt better rather than worse. The pretense was over. I no longer had to wonder about their motives or question my own perceptions. They wanted my house, and they were willing to use emotional blackmail and manipulation to get it. But they'd also revealed their hand too early. By showing me the real estate listing and admitting they'd already contacted an agent, they'd demonstrated that this had never been about my welfare. It was a calculated plan to separate me from my most valuable asset, and they'd expected me to cooperate quietly because I was old and supposedly unable to think for myself. The next morning, I called Robert Chen and described the confrontation in detail. He listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about specific statements they'd made. "Margaret, I think it's time we took some protective measures," he said when I finished. "Based on what you've told me, I believe they're going to try more aggressive tactics. We need to make sure you're legally protected before they escalate." Further, Robert recommended several immediate steps. First, we would update my will to include specific language about my mental competency at the time of signing, making it more difficult for anyone to challenge my decisions later. Second, we would prepare a power of attorney document that clearly specified my choices about medical and financial decisions, naming my sister Helen as my primary agent instead of David. Most importantly, he suggested we document everything that had happened so far in a formal legal statement. "If they continue to pressure you or take any action regarding your property without your consent, we'll have a clear record of their pattern of behavior," he explained. I spent the next week following Robert's advice and taking additional protective measures on my own. I changed my bank accounts to remove David as an emergency contact, replacing him with Helen. I contacted my doctor and asked for a comprehensive evaluation that would document my current physical and mental health, creating an official record of my competency. I also did something that felt both liberating and terrifying. I blocked David and Jessica's phone numbers. For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing my own peace of mind over my son's access to me. The silence in my house felt different than it had before. Instead of lonely, it felt protected. The response came exactly 1 week later, not from David or Jessica directly, but from Linda Morrison at Premier Properties. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, introducing herself cheerfully and explaining that she'd been hired to provide a market analysis for my property. "I understand you're considering selling your lovely home on Maple Street," she said in the practiced tone of someone accustomed to dealing with elderly sellers. "I'd love to schedule a time to walk through and give you some preliminary numbers. The market is really strong right now for properties like yours." "I'm not selling my house," I told her firmly. "And I didn't hire you to do any kind of analysis." There was a pause. "Oh, I'm sorry. I was contacted by David Thornton, who said he was helping you with some estate planning decisions. He seemed to think you were ready to move into a more suitable living situation." David Thornton has no authority to make decisions about my property, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. If he contacts you again about this house, please inform him that any further communication should go through my attorney. After I hung up, I called Robert immediately. He listened to my account of the realtor's call with growing concern. Margaret, this is harassment at minimum, and possibly attempted fraud. They're representing themselves as having authority over your property when they have no such legal standing. We need to send them a formal cease and desist letter immediately. The letter Robert drafted was professionally worded, but unmistakably clear. David and Jessica were to stop all contact with real estate agents, assisted living facilities, or any other service providers regarding my property or living situation. They were prohibited from representing themselves as having any authority over my affairs, and any further harassment would result in legal action. Robert hand-delivered the letter to their condo, ensuring there could be no question about whether they'd received it. The response came 2 days later in the form of a voicemail from David that managed to be both hurt and threatening at the same time. Mom, I can't believe you got lawyers involved in a family matter. Jessica and I were just trying to help you, and now you're treating us like criminals. This is exactly the kind of confused thinking that proves you need someone looking out for your best interests. Call me back so we can straighten this out before you do something you'll really regret. I didn't call him back. Instead, I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Robert as additional evidence of their continued pressure tactics. The message revealed their strategy clearly. They planned to use my legal action as proof that I was mentally incompetent and needed their intervention. But I was no longer the confused, guilt-ridden mother who had questioned her own perceptions. I was a woman with legal representation, documented competency, and a clear understanding of exactly what was happening. Every move they made now would be scrutinized by professionals who understood manipulation tactics and elder abuse. The war for my independence had moved beyond family dynamics into legal territory, and I was prepared for whatever came next. They'd expected me to be an easy target, a lonely old woman who could be pressured into giving up everything she'd worked for. Instead, they'd awakened a fighter who had spent decades navigating complex challenges and wasn't about to surrender without a battle. What they didn't know yet was that I'd been doing more than just playing defense. While they'd been focused on trying to manipulate me out of my house, I'd been researching options for ensuring they could never succeed in their plans, no matter what tactics they tried next. The protective measures Robert had helped me implement were just the beginning. I had spent my entire adult life being reactive, responding to challenges and crises as they arose. But this situation required something different. It required me to be proactive, strategic, and absolutely ruthless in protecting what was mine. David and Jessica had taught me that family loyalty could be weaponized against me. Now, I was going to teach them that underestimating a determined woman was a mistake they would regret for a very long time. The discovery came by accident on a snowy February morning when I was sorting through old financial records for my annual tax preparation. I'd been methodically organizing receipts and statements in my home office, the small den off the kitchen that I'd converted into a workspace years earlier. Among the papers scattered across my desk was a folder I'd forgotten about, labeled Property Documents in my own careful handwriting. Inside, beneath the original mortgage papers and insurance policies, I found something that made my hands tremble as I held it. It was a quitclaim deed, signed and notarized, transferring ownership of my house from my name alone to joint ownership with David. The signature looked remarkably like mine, and the date showed it had been executed just 3 months earlier, in November. I stared at the document for a long time, my mind racing through the implications. If this deed was legitimate, David would have legal claim to half my house. He could force a sale, demand his share of the equity, or potentially, even evict me from my own home. But I had absolutely no memory of signing any such document. My first call was to Robert Chen, though it took me several minutes to calm down enough to explain what I'd found. Robert listened carefully as I read him the details of the deed, including the notary information and the supposed date of signing. "Margaret, bring that document to my office immediately," he said, his usually calm voice tight with concern. "Don't touch it any more than necessary, and don't let anyone know you found it." The drive to Robert's office felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every possible explanation raced through my mind, each one more disturbing than the last. Had I somehow signed something without understanding what it was? Had David forged my signature? Was I losing my memory in ways I hadn't recognized? Robert examined the deed under a magnifying glass, comparing the signature to other documents I'd signed recently. He studied the notary seal, checked the paper and ink for signs of aging, and made several phone calls to verify the notary's legitimacy. "This is a forgery," he said finally, his voice grim. "A sophisticated one, but a forgery nonetheless. The signature is close, but there are subtle differences in the way you form certain letters. More importantly, I have your appointment calendar, and you were never in the location where this was supposedly notarized on that date." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I actually felt dizzy. I wasn't losing my mind or my memory. But the relief was quickly replaced by a cold anger that settled in my chest like ice. "David forged my signature to steal my house," I said, stating the reality out loud. "That's exactly what happened," Robert confirmed. "This is felony fraud, and we need to act quickly. If he tries to record this deed with the county, it could create serious legal complications for you, even though it's fraudulent." Robert immediately began the process of protecting my property legally. He filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office, alerting them that any attempt to record a deed transferring my property should be flagged for investigation. He also contacted the district attorney's office to report the forgery and begin the process of pressing criminal charges. But most importantly, he helped me understand something that changed everything about my situation. In researching the forged deed, Robert had discovered that David and Jessica had been planning this theft for much longer than I'd realized. The notary whose seal had been used was someone who worked at Jessica's consulting firm. Bank records showed that David had been making inquiries about property transfers and tax implications for months. "Margaret, this wasn't a desperate last resort," Robert explained. "This was a calculated, premeditated plan to defraud you of your most valuable asset. They've been setting this up since at least last summer." The timeline made horrible sense. All those conversations about my future care needs, all the pressure to move into assisted living, all the concerns about my ability to manage the house had been cover for a crime they were planning to commit. They'd tried manipulation first, hoping I'd cooperate willingly. When that failed, they'd move to fraud. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the phone number Robert had given me for Detective Sarah Martinez, the officer assigned to investigate financial crimes against elderly victims. Tomorrow, I would file a formal police report against my own son for attempting to steal my house through forgery and fraud. The thought should have devastated me. The little boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been so proud of, the son who had once brought me flowers from the school garden had become someone capable of stealing from his own mother. But instead of devastation, I felt something unexpected: clarity. For months I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was being unreasonable or stubborn. I'd felt guilty for not trusting David's motives and for resisting their pressure to move. But the forged deed proved that my instincts had been correct all along. They weren't concerned family members trying to help an aging relative make good decisions. They were criminals attempting to steal my property through deception and fraud. The meeting with Detective Martinez took place the next afternoon at the police station downtown. She was a woman about Jessica's age, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately put me at ease. She'd clearly handled cases like mine before, and understood both the legal and emotional complexities involved. Mrs. Thornton, financial crimes against elderly victims are unfortunately common, but it's unusual to see this level of sophistication from family members, she said, after reviewing the forged deed and Robert's documentation. This required planning, research, and access to professional resources. It's not a crime of opportunity. Detective Martinez explained the investigation process and what I could expect in the coming weeks. They would examine the notary seal, interview the consulting firm employee whose credentials had been misused, and trace the paper trail of David and Jessica's planning. If the evidence supported criminal charges, they would be arrested and prosecuted for elder fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. "I need to ask you directly," Detective Martinez said. "Are you prepared for the consequences of pursuing this case? Your son could face serious jail time if convicted, and this will almost certainly destroy your relationship permanently." I thought about David as a little boy, crying when he scraped his knee, laughing when I pushed him on the swing set in our backyard. I thought about his graduation day, his wedding, all the moments when I'd been so proud to be his mother. Then I thought about the forged signature on the deed, the months of manipulation, the casual way they'd discussed selling my house without my consent. "Detective Martinez, my son stopped being my son the moment he decided to steal from me," I said. "I won't let anyone, family or otherwise, take advantage of me because they think I'm too old or too trusting to fight back." The investigation moved quickly once it began. Within a week, Detective Martinez had confirmed that the notary seal was stolen and that David had been researching property transfer procedures online for months. They'd also discovered that Jessica had used her company's legal resources to research the technical requirements for quitclaim deeds, clearly establishing her involvement in the scheme. But while the police were building their case, David and Jessica were escalating their campaign against me. Apparently sensing that their time was running out, they began a series of increasingly desperate attempts to gain control of my situation. First came the wellness check. On a Tuesday morning, 2 police officers arrived at my door, explaining that they'd received a report from a concerned family member who believed I might be in danger or unable to care for myself. David had called them, claiming that I'd become paranoid and confused, that I was making irrational accusations against family members, and that he was worried about my mental state. The officers were professional and courteous, but I could see the doubt in their eyes as they looked at my well-maintained home and observed my clear, coherent responses to their questions. I showed them my recent medical records, my organized financial documents, and the legal paperwork Robert had prepared documenting my competency. "Ma'am, you seem perfectly capable of caring for yourself," one officer said apologetically. "But we're required to file a report whenever we respond to these calls. Is there anything you'd like us to document about this situation?" I gave them Detective Martinez's contact information and explained that there was an ongoing investigation into financial fraud attempts by the same family members who had called for the wellness check. The officers took detailed notes and assured me that any future calls would be viewed in the context of the existing criminal investigation. The next attack came through Adult Protective Services. David had filed a formal complaint alleging that I was a vulnerable adult in need of intervention, claiming that I was isolated, paranoid, and making poor decisions about my financial affairs. A social worker named Jennifer Walsh was assigned to investigate and requested a meeting to assess my living situation and mental capacity. Unlike the police wellness check, this felt more threatening. Adult Protective Services had the authority to petition for guardianship if they believed I was incompetent, potentially giving someone else legal control over my life and assets. Even though I was confident in my mental capacity, the process itself could be lengthy and expensive to fight. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be a thoughtful professional who quickly realized that David's allegations were unfounded. She spent 2 hours in my home, reviewing my medical records, observing my daily routines, and asking detailed questions about my finances and self-care abilities. Her report concluded that I was fully competent and living independently without any support needs. "Mrs. Thornton, in my professional opinion, you're being targeted for financial exploitation," she told me before leaving. The complaint against you shows all the classic signs of someone trying to establish a paper trail of incompetency to support a guardianship petition. I'll be documenting my findings carefully to prevent any future attempts along those lines. But the most disturbing escalation came 2 weeks later when I discovered that someone had been inside my house while I was out. I'd gone to my weekly book club meeting, something I'd been doing for years, and returned to find subtle signs that my home had been searched. Nothing was missing, but papers in my desk had been rearranged, and my bedroom showed signs of careful searching. My first thought was that I'd been burglarized, but nothing of value was gone. My jewelry box was untouched, my electronics were all in place, and even the cash I kept in my kitchen jar for emergencies hadn't been disturbed. Someone had been looking for something specific, and I had a strong suspicion about what they'd been seeking. I called Detective Martinez immediately, and she sent a forensics team to process the scene. They found clear evidence of entry through the back door, which had been carefully jimmied in a way that left minimal damage. Most telling, they found fingerprints in my home office that matched samples they'd already collected from David during the fraud investigation. "Mrs. Thornton, this is breaking and entering in addition to the fraud charges," Detective Martinez explained. "Your son has now committed multiple felonies in his attempt to gain control of your property. We're going to arrest him and his wife tomorrow morning." That night, I barely slept. Tomorrow, my son would be arrested for trying to steal from beige. Me, for forging legal documents, for breaking into my home. The little boy I'd tucked into bed for so many years would be spending the night in jail because of crimes he'd committed against me. But alongside the sadness was something else. Relief. For months, I'd been under siege in my own home, questioning my perceptions and fighting an enemy I couldn't quite see clearly. Tomorrow, the truth would finally be public, documented, and legally established. I wasn't a paranoid old woman making false accusations against caring family members. I was the victim of a sophisticated fraud scheme perpetrated by people who had counted on my love and trust to protect them from consequences. They'd assumed I would never fight back, never seek legal help, never risk destroying our family relationships to protect myself. They'd been wrong about that, just as they'd been wrong about everything else. I wasn't the helpless elderly victim they'd thought they were targeting. I was a woman who had spent decades learning how to protect herself and fight for what was hers. And tomorrow, they would finally face the consequences of underestimating me so completely. As I lay in bed that final night before their arrest, I thought about the house around me. Every room held memories of the life I'd built here, the family I'd raised, the independence I'd fought to maintain. David and Jessica had tried to take all of that away through lies, manipulation, and finally outright theft. Instead, they were about to lose everything themselves. Their reputations, their freedom, their futures, all sacrificed in pursuit of property that had never belonged to them. They'd destroyed our family relationship permanently, but they'd also freed me from the burden of trying to maintain love and loyalty with people who saw me only as an obstacle to overcome. Tomorrow would bring justice, but it would also bring a new kind of freedom. The freedom to live without fear, without manipulation, without the constant pressure to justify my right to exist in my own space. David and Jessica had taught me that I could be strong enough to stand alone, and that lesson would serve me well in whatever years remained. The house on Maple Street would remain mine, just as it always had been. But more importantly, I would remain myself. Margaret, the woman who had built this life through her own effort and who had defended it when it came under attack. That was a victory worth more than any property, and one that no one could ever take away from me. The arrests happened at dawn on a Thursday morning in early March. I wasn't there to witness them, but Detective Martinez called me afterward with the details. David and Jessica had been taken into custody at their downtown condo, both charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, attempted theft, and breaking and entering. Jessica had tried to claim ignorance of the forged deed, but the evidence of her research into property transfer laws made that defense impossible. The local newspaper ran a small item about the arrests in their crime section, describing it as an elder fraud case involving a son and daughter-in-law accused of attempting to steal their victim's home through forged documents. They didn't print names, but in a city the size of ours, word traveled quickly through certain circles. I spent that morning in my garden, pruning the roses that would bloom again in a few months, and planning the vegetable plot I'd expand this year. The physical work felt grounding after months of legal battles and emotional turmoil. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could work in my yard without looking over my shoulder or wondering who might be watching me. The phone calls started around noon. First Helen, who had seen the news online and wanted to make sure I was all right. Then neighbors who had heard rumors and were calling to express their support. Most surprising was a call from Judith, David's mother-in-law, Jessica's mother, who had always been coolly polite to me at family gatherings. "Margaret, I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. Jessica's father and I had no idea what they were planning, but looking back, there were signs we should have noticed. Jessica has always been entitled, always believed she deserved whatever she wanted regardless of how she got it. We failed to raise her better, and you've paid the price for our failures. Her honesty was unexpected and surprisingly healing. For months, I'd felt like the entire world was against me, like I was fighting alone against people everyone else saw as caring family members. Having someone from their own circle acknowledge the truth meant more than I could have anticipated. "I appreciate you calling," I told her. "This has been one of the hardest experiences of my life, not just because of what they did, but because for so long I thought I might be wrong about what was happening." "You weren't wrong," Judith said firmly. "You were protecting yourself. From people who saw your love and trust as weaknesses to exploit. That's not paranoia, Margaret. That's survival." The legal proceedings moved through the court system with surprising efficiency. Robert explained that financial crimes against elderly victims were prosecuted aggressively in our county, and the evidence against David and Jessica was overwhelming. The forged deed, the documented planning, the break-in, all of it painted a clear picture of premeditated fraud. David's public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal that would have involved restitution and probation rather than jail time, but the prosecutor refused. "Your clients targeted a 72-year-old woman and attempted to steal her home through sophisticated fraud," she told the defense team during a hearing I attended. "This wasn't a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated crime that could have left the victim homeless and destitute." Jessica hired her own attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer who tried to argue that she'd been manipulated by David and hadn't understood the legal implications of her actions. But her research into property transfer laws, documented in her work computer, contradicted that defense completely. During the pre-trial phase, I learned details about their planning that shocked me even after everything I'd already discovered. They'd been discussing my house and how to acquire it since the first month of their marriage. Text messages recovered from their phones showed conversations about my age, my health, and strategies for convincing me to move out voluntarily. Most disturbing were messages Jessica had sent to friends, describing me as David's crazy mother who's hoarding a huge house she doesn't need, and expressing frustration that I was too stubborn to accept reality about aging. She'd actually complained to her social circle that I was being selfish by continuing to live in my own home. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed something that explained a great deal about their behavior. Jessica scored high on measures of narcissistic personality traits, with particular emphasis on entitlement and lack of empathy. The psychologist's report noted that she appeared genuinely unable to understand why her actions were wrong, seeing herself as the victim of an ungrateful older woman who was preventing her from having what she deserved. David's evaluation was more complex. The psychologist found evidence of emotional dependency and poor judgment, but not the same level of personality disorder that Jessica displayed. It appeared that he'd been gradually manipulated into participating in her scheme. Though that didn't excuse his choices or reduce his legal culpability, reading those reports was like looking at my family through a completely different lens. The son I'd raised had allowed himself to be convinced that I was the obstacle preventing them from having the life they wanted. Instead of protecting me or defending our relationship, he'd chosen to participate in a plan to defraud me of everything I'd worked for. The trial took place in late spring, and I attended every day of proceedings. I wanted to see justice done, but I also needed to hear the complete truth about what they'd planned and how close they'd come to succeeding. The prosecutor called me as the primary witness, and I spent 2 days on the stand describing the months of pressure, manipulation, and escalating threats I'd endured. David's defense attorney tried to portray me as confused and vindictive, an unreliable witness whose testimony couldn't be trusted. But Robert had prepared me well, and I answered every question clearly and factually. When the defense attorney suggested that I might have actually signed the deed and forgotten about it due to age-related memory issues, I calmly recited the exact date, time, and location where I'd supposedly signed it, then explained why I knew with certainty I'd never been there. The most difficult moment came when I had to identify David in court and confirm that he was my son. Looking at him sitting at the defendant's table, wearing a suit I'd helped him buy for job interviews years earlier, was almost unbearable. This was the child I'd loved unconditionally, the young man I'd been so proud of, reduced to a criminal defendant who had tried to steal my home. But when our eyes met across the courtroom, I didn't see remorse or shame. I saw anger. He was furious with me for fighting back, for refusing to be the victim he'd expected me to be. Even facing felony charges, he still believed I was wrong for defending myself against his fraud. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for both defendants. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the prosecutor indicated they would be seeking substantial jail time, given the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the vulnerability of the victim. Between the guilty verdicts and sentencing, I received an unexpected visit from David. He was out on bail, living with his parents while awaiting his fate, and he appeared at my door on a rainy Saturday afternoon looking haggard and desperate. "Mom, please," he said before I could speak. "You have to help me. The prosecutor says I could get 3 to 5 years in prison. That will destroy my career, my whole future. Can't you tell them you don't want to press charges?" I studied the face of this man who had once been my beloved child, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding of what he'd done to me. Instead, I saw only self-pity and desperation. Even now, facing the consequences of his crimes, he couldn't acknowledge that I was the victim rather than the villain in this situation. "David, you tried to steal my house through fraud," I said quietly. "You forged my signature on legal documents. You broke into my home and searched through my private papers. You put me through months of emotional torture while pretending to care about my welfare. And now you want me to help you avoid consequences for those actions? I never meant for it to go this far," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Jessica said it would be better for everyone if we just took care of the house and made sure you were somewhere safe. She said you'd be happier in assisted living once you got used to it." "Better for everyone," I repeated. "Everyone except me, you mean?" "David, you've been lying to me and manipulating me for over a year. You've destroyed any trust or love that existed between us. Why would you think I'd help you now?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the exact instant when his desperation turned back to anger. "Because I'm your son," he said, his voice rising. "Because no matter what happened, I'm still your family. That's supposed to mean something." Family doesn't try to steal from each other, I replied. Family doesn't lie and manipulate and forge documents to take advantage of someone they're supposed to love. You stopped being my family the moment you decided I was an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to respect. He left without another word, and I knew it would be the last conversation we'd ever have. Whatever relationship we'd once shared had died long before that moment, killed by his choices and his willingness to prioritize his desires over my dignity and security. The sentencing hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in June. The courtroom was packed with supporters for both sides, though the majority were there for me. Helen had flown in from Phoenix to be present, along with several neighbors and friends from my book club who wanted to show their support. David and Jessica each had family members present as well, people who still believed they were fundamentally good people who had simply made mistakes. I watched their relatives' faces as the prosecutor read the full details of their scheme into the record, seeing the gradual realization that this hadn't been a moment of poor judgment, but a calculated, criminal enterprise. The judge was a woman in her 60s who had clearly dealt with similar cases before. She listened carefully to the defense attorney's pleas for leniency, their arguments about first-time offender status and family circumstances. Then she asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I stood up slowly, my prepared remarks, forgotten as I looked at David and Jessica one final time. Your Honor, these defendants didn't just try to steal my property. They tried to steal my autonomy, my dignity, and my right to make decisions about my own life. They used my love for my son as a weapon against me, counting on my desire to maintain family relationships to prevent me from protecting myself. For months, they made me question my own judgment and competency. They isolated me from support systems and made me feel like I was being unreasonable for wanting to remain in my own home. They turned what should have been my golden years into a nightmare of manipulation and fear. But perhaps most importantly, they taught me something valuable about my own strength. I discovered that I don't need anyone's approval to stand up for myself. I don't need to preserve relationships with people who see me as an obstacle to their desires. I learned that being alone is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who are plotting against you. I'm asking you to impose a sentence that reflects the seriousness of their crimes and sends a message that elderly victims are not easy targets. We will fight back, and those who prey on us will face consequences. The judge sentenced David to 2 years in state prison followed by 3 years of probation. Jessica received 3 years in prison due to her leadership role in planning the fraud. Both were ordered to pay substantial fines and court costs, and they were permanently barred from having any contact with me. As the bailiffs led them away, in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete peace. The nightmare was finally over. The people who had terrorized me and tried to steal my home were going to prison, and I was free to live my life without fear or manipulation. The years that followed were among the happiest of my life. Without the constant stress of defending myself against David and Jessica's schemes, my health improved dramatically. I had energy for activities I'd neglected during the crisis, and I discovered new interests and friendships that enriched my daily existence. I joined a gardening club and became known for my prize-winning tomatoes. I volunteered at the hospital where I'd once worked, helping other elderly patients navigate complex medical decisions. Most meaningfully, I started speaking at community centers about elder fraud, sharing my story to help other seniors recognize and resist manipulation tactics. Through my advocacy work, I met other women who had survived financial abuse by family members. We formed an informal support network, meeting monthly to share experiences and strategies for maintaining independence as we aged. Many of these women became closer to me than any family had ever been. Helen moved back from Phoenix after her husband passed away, and we found a comfort in each other's company that reminded me of our childhood closeness. She helped me update my home with safety features that allowed me to age in place confidently, and I helped her navigate her grief and build a new life as a widow. The house on Maple Street remained my sanctuary, but it evolved to reflect my new understanding of myself. I redecorated the rooms David and Jessica had criticized, choosing colors and furniture that pleased me rather than anyone else. I expanded the garden and created sitting areas where I could read and entertain the friends who had become my chosen family. Most importantly, I updated my estate planning to reflect my changed circumstances. Helen would inherit the house, with specific instructions that it should never be sold to anyone connected to David or Jessica. The rest of my assets would go to organizations that help elderly victims of financial abuse, ensuring that my resources would continue protecting vulnerable seniors long after I was gone. 5 years after the trial, I received a letter from David. He was out of prison, divorced from Jessica, and living in another state where he was trying to rebuild his life. The letter was full of apologies and expressions of regret, along with a request to reconcile and rebuild our relationship. I read the letter once, then filed it away without responding. The man who wrote those words might genuinely regret his actions, but too much had been destroyed for any real reconciliation to be possible. He had shown me who he really was during the darkest period of my life, and I believed him. More importantly, I had built a life that no longer had room for people who had once tried to manipulate and control me. I was surrounded by relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I had purposes that fulfilled me and activities that brought me joy. I had security that no one could threaten and independence that I'd fought to preserve. The woman who had once doubted her own perceptions and questioned her right to defend her home had become someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than she deserved. I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-sufficient than I'd ever been. On quiet evenings, I sometimes sat on my front porch and looked at the neighborhood where I'd raised my son and built my life. The house next door had new owners, a young couple with children who reminded me of David at that age. I watched them play in their yard and hoped their parents would teach them that love and family loyalty should never be used as weapons against the people who care about them most. The garage that David and Jessica had wanted to move me into had been converted into a workshop where I pursued woodworking, a hobby I'd discovered during my recovery from the trauma they'd inflicted. The irony wasn't lost on me that the space they'd seen as my exile had become a source of creativity and accomplishment. I was 77 now, still living independently in the home I'd defended so fiercely. My health was good, my mind was sharp, and my future was secure. I had learned to trust my instincts, protect my boundaries, and choose my relationships carefully. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that age doesn't make someone powerless unless they choose to accept powerlessness. The story of David and Jessica's attempt to steal my home had become a cautionary tale in our community, shared as a warning about the sophisticated tactics used by family members who prey on elderly relatives. But for me, it had become something else entirely. Proof that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, and that fighting for myself had been worth every difficult moment. When people asked if I regretted pursuing criminal charges against my own son, I always gave them the same answer. I regretted that it had been necessary, but I didn't regret protecting myself from people who saw my love as weakness to exploit. Family relationships should be sources of strength and support, not vehicles for manipulation and theft. The house on Maple Street would remain mine for as long as I chose to live here, exactly as it should be. I had earned that security through decades of hard work, and I had defended it when it came under attack. That victory belonged to me alone, and it could never be taken away. 10 years had passed since the trial that changed everything, and I was celebrating my 82nd birthday in a way I never could have imagined during those dark months when David and Jessica were trying to steal my home. My living room was filled with laughter, the sound of genuine friendship and chosen family gathering to honor not just another year of life, but a decade of freedom and self-determination. Helen, now 77 herself, was arranging flowers from my garden in the crystal vase that had belonged to our grandmother. Dorothy from my book club was setting up the chessboard near the window, preparing for our weekly game that had become a cherished tradition. Maria, a woman I'd met through my elder advocacy work, who had survived financial abuse by her own daughter, was helping with the preparations for the small party we'd planned. The house looked exactly as I wanted it to look, decorated with photographs of the life I'd built after the trial, filled with furniture I'd chosen because it pleased me, painted in colors that reflected my personality rather than anyone else's preferences. The garage workshop where I'd spent countless peaceful hours creating wooden jewelry boxes and picture frames was visible through the kitchen window, a testament to the creativity I'd discovered in my 70s. Mrs. Patterson from down the street, the woman whose fall David and Jessica had once used to frighten me about living alone, arrived with her walker and her customary plate of cookies. At 91, she was still living independently in her own home, having recovered completely from her hip fracture and become one of my closest confidants in our shared determination to age on our own terms. "Margaret, you look wonderful," she said, embracing me with the warmth of someone who understood exactly what this milestone represented. "Every year you get stronger and more beautiful. It's like watching a flower bloom in reverse." I laughed at her poetic description, but there was truth in it. The years since the trial had been a process of continuous growth and discovery. Free from the constant stress of manipulation and threats, I'd flourished in ways I hadn't thought possible at my age. My arthritis was manageable through gentle exercise and physical therapy. My blood pressure was better controlled than it had been in decades. Most importantly, my spirit was lighter than it had been since my youth. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Dr. Williams, my physician who had become a friend over the years. He'd been instrumental in documenting my competency during the legal battle, and his continued support had been invaluable as I navigated the challenges of aging while maintaining my independence. "Happy birthday, Margaret," he said, handing me a small wrapped package. "I brought you something I thought you'd appreciate." Inside was a framed certificate recognizing my contributions to elder rights advocacy in our county. Over the past decade, I'd spoken at dozens of community events, helped establish a support group for elder abuse survivors, and worked with law enforcement to improve their response to financial crimes against seniors. The recognition felt meaningful, not because of the honor itself, but because it represented how I'd transformed my trauma into purpose. "Dr. Williams, this is beautiful, but you know the real reward has been seeing other people find the strength to protect themselves," I said. "Every time someone tells me my story helped them recognize manipulation or gave them courage to seek help, I know that everything David and Jessica put me through served a larger purpose." As the afternoon progressed, more friends arrived, each bringing their own stories of resilience and independence. There was Ruth, an 85-year-old retired teacher who had fought off her nephew's attempts to gain control of her finances. There was Joan, a widow who had resisted her children's pressure to sell her farm and move to the city. There was Elizabeth, whose grandson had tried to convince her she had dementia so he could take over her bank accounts. These women had become my strongest allies and dearest friends, bound together by our shared understanding that aging doesn't require surrendering autonomy. We'd supported each other through health scares, family conflicts, and the daily challenges of maintaining independence. In a society that often assumes elderly people are automatically vulnerable and incompetent. "I want to propose a toast," Helen said, raising her glass of sparkling apple cider. "To Margaret, who taught all of us that fighting for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And to friendship that grows stronger with time instead of weaker." As we raised our glasses, I thought about the woman I'd been a decade earlier, confused and frightened by my son's behavior, questioning my own judgment, allowing myself to be made to feel guilty for wanting to remain in my own home. That woman had been trapped by her need for approval and her fear of conflict. She'd nearly lost everything because she couldn't believe the people she loved were capable of betraying her so completely. The woman I'd become was fundamentally different. Not harder or more cynical, but clearer about boundaries and more confident in her own perceptions. I'd learned to trust my instincts even when others questioned them. I'd discovered that being alone was infinitely preferable to being surrounded by people who didn't respect me. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that I was capable of protecting what mattered most, even when the threats came from unexpected sources. After the guests left that evening, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and the photo album I'd created documenting the past decade. There were pictures from my woodworking classes, images of the vegetables I'd grown in my expanded garden, photographs from the trips I'd taken with Helen and other friends. There were also newspaper clippings about my advocacy work and letters from people who had been helped by the support group I'd helped establish. But my favorite section contained pictures of the house itself, showing how it had evolved to reflect my true preferences rather than what I thought others expected. The living room walls were now painted a warm yellow that reminded me of sunshine. The kitchen had been updated with appliances that made cooking enjoyable rather than burdensome. The guest room had been converted into a library where I could read and write in comfortable solitude. The house had become more than just the property David and Jessica had tried to steal. It had become the physical manifestation of my independence, the proof that I could make decisions about my own life and live with the consequences of those choices. Every room reflected my taste, my needs, my vision of how I wanted to spend my remaining years. I turned to a section of the album dedicated to the legal resolution of David and Jessica's crimes. There were photographs of the courthouse, copies of the newspaper articles about their sentencing, and the formal documents that had cleared my property title of any fraudulent claims. But what I treasured most was a letter from the prosecutor who had handled their case, written on the 5th anniversary of their conviction. "Dear Mrs. Thornton," it read, "I wanted you to know that your case has become a model for how we prosecute elder fraud in our county. Your courage in pursuing charges against family members and your eloquent testimony about the impact of financial abuse has helped us secure convictions in dozens of similar cases. You didn't just protect yourself, you protected countless other seniors who might have become victims of similar schemes." The letter went on to describe how my case had led to changes in state law, making it easier to prosecute family members who commit financial crimes against elderly relatives. It had also inspired training programs for law enforcement and social workers to better recognize the sophisticated manipulation tactics used by relatives who prey on older family members. Reading that letter again reminded me of something I'd discovered during the darkest period of the legal battle. Personal trauma could be transformed into social good if you had the courage to share your story and fight for systemic change. My willingness to speak publicly about what David and Jessica had done hadn't just helped me heal. It had created resources for other people facing similar situations. Over the years, I'd received hundreds of letters and emails from people who had heard my story and found the strength to protect themselves from manipulative family members. There was the woman in Oregon whose daughter was trying to force her into a nursing home to gain access to her inheritance. There was the man in Florida whose son was systematically draining his retirement accounts through forged documents. There was the widow in Texas whose grandson was using her grief over her husband's death to manipulate her into signing over her property. Each of these people had found the courage to seek help after hearing how I'd fought back against David and Jessica's scheme. They'd learned to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation disguised as family concern. They'd discovered that they didn't have to accept abuse simply because it came from people who claimed to love them. But perhaps most importantly, they'd learned that age doesn't automatically make someone powerless. The stereotype of elderly people as confused, helpless victims who need others to make decisions for them is not only false, but dangerous. It creates an environment where predators can operate freely, confident that their victims won't fight back and that society won't take their complaints seriously. My story had become proof that seniors could be formidable opponents when their independence was threatened. The court case had demonstrated that elderly victims could navigate complex legal systems, present compelling testimony, and achieve justice even against sophisticated criminals who assumed they would be easy targets. I pulled out the latest letter I'd received just 2 weeks earlier from a woman named Catherine in Minnesota. Her adult children were pressuring her to move into assisted living so they could sell her house and divide the proceeds. They'd been using the same tactics David and Jessica had employed, expressing fake concern about her safety, criticizing her ability to maintain her property, and making her feel guilty for not cooperating with their plans. After reading about your case online, I realized I wasn't going crazy, Catherine had written. My children weren't really worried about my welfare. They were worried about their inheritance. I've hired a lawyer and documented everything they've said and done. I'm fighting back, just like you did. Thank you for showing me that I don't have to be a victim. Stories like Catherine's reminded me that the battle I'd fought wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger cultural struggle about how society treats aging individuals. Too often, families see elderly relatives as burdens to be managed rather than people whose wishes should be respected. Too often, adult children assume they know what's best for their parents without considering what those parents actually want for themselves. The legal system, medical professionals, and even well-meaning social workers sometimes reinforce these attitudes by automatically assuming that family members have elderly people's best interests at heart. My case had helped challenge those assumptions and create space for elderly people's own voices to be heard and believed. As I prepared for bed that night, I walked through each room of my house, turning off lights and checking locks with the satisfied routine of someone who felt completely secure in her own space. The bedroom where I'd once lain awake worrying about David and Jessica's next move now felt like a sanctuary. The kitchen where they'd criticized my cooking and questioned my ability to care for myself had become a place of creativity and nourishment. The garage that had given this story its title, the space where they'd planned to exile me while they took over my home, was now filled with the tools and projects that brought me joy. The irony wasn't lost on me that the place they'd seen as suitable for my diminished existence had become the birthplace of new talents and interests I'd discovered in my 70s and 80s. But the most profound change was in myself. The woman who had once questioned her own perceptions when family members criticized her choices had become someone who trusted her instincts completely. The person who had felt guilty for wanting to remain in her own home had learned that there was nothing selfish about protecting her independence and security. I'd discovered that love and loyalty should flow both ways in family relationships. Children who truly care about their parents' welfare respect their parents' choices, even when those choices aren't what the children would prefer. Family members who have your best interests at heart listen to your concerns, rather than dismissing them as signs of incompetence. Most importantly, I'd learned that being alone was not the same as being lonely. The house that David and Jessica had portrayed as too large and isolating for an elderly woman had become a haven of peace and creativity. The independence they'd characterized as dangerous stubbornness had become the foundation of a life rich with purpose and satisfaction. The friends who gathered for my birthday celebration weren't family by blood, but they were family by choice. They supported my decisions without trying to control them. They celebrated my accomplishments without feeling threatened by them. They offered help when I needed it without assuming I was incapable of caring for myself. These relationships had taught me that the family you create can be more meaningful and supportive than the family you're born into. When blood relatives betray your trust and try to exploit your love for them, there's no obligation to continue subjecting yourself to their manipulation simply because of genetic connections. David had been released from prison 6 years earlier, and Jessica had been out for 4 years. Both had attempted to contact me multiple times, sending letters that ranged from angry accusations to tearful apologies. David had tried to reach me through mutual acquaintances, claiming he'd changed and wanted to make amends. Jessica had even shown up at my house once, though I'd called the police immediately and she'd been warned not to return. I'd read their letters but never responded. Whatever remorse they might feel couldn't undo the months of terror they'd put me through or repair the trust they'd destroyed. More importantly, the life I'd built without them was so much better than anything we'd shared that I had no desire to risk disrupting it for the sake of reconciliation. Some people had criticized my refusal to forgive them, suggesting that holding grudges was unhealthy and that family relationships should be preserved regardless of past behavior. But I'd learned to distinguish between forgiveness and foolishness. I could forgive them for my own peace of mind without allowing them back into my life where they could harm me again. Forgiveness didn't require me to pretend their crimes hadn't happened or to act as if they deserved another chance to prove themselves. It simply meant releasing the anger and bitterness that might otherwise poison my own happiness. I'd forgiven them by building a life so fulfilling that their betrayal no longer defined my daily existence. The clock in my bedroom chimed 11. As I settled into bed with the book I was currently reading, a mystery novel by an author I'd discovered through my book club. Tomorrow would bring another day of the peaceful, purposeful life I'd created for myself. I would tend my garden, work on a jewelry box I was crafting for Helen's granddaughter, and attend a planning meeting for the Elder Advocacy Group's upcoming conference. These activities might seem mundane to outside observers, but they represented something profound to me: the freedom to choose how I spent my time based on my own interests and values, rather than other people's expectations or demands. Every decision I made was mine alone. From what I ate for breakfast, to how I decorated my living room, to whether I accepted social invitations. This autonomy was what David and Jessica had tried to steal from me through their manipulation and fraud. They'd wanted to reduce me to a manageable problem that could be solved by relocating me to an institution where others would make decisions about my daily life. They'd tried to convince me that I was incapable of managing my own affairs, and that accepting their control was the sensible, mature thing to do. Instead, they'd awakened a fierce determination to protect my independence that had surprised even me. The quiet, accommodating woman who had spent decades avoiding conflict and seeking approval had discovered reserves of strength and stubbornness that proved more than adequate to the challenge they'd presented. In fighting for my right to remain in my own home, I'd also fought for something larger: the right of elderly people to be treated as competent adults capable of making their own decisions until proven otherwise. Too often, society assumes that reaching a certain age automatically makes someone vulnerable and in need of protection, even when that protection comes at the cost of personal freedom and dignity. My case had helped establish legal precedents. That made it more difficult for family members to exploit elderly relatives through false claims of incompetency. It had also raised awareness among seniors about their rights and resources for protecting themselves from financial abuse. Most importantly, it had shown that elderly people could be powerful advocates for themselves when necessary. As I drifted off to sleep in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by possessions I'd chosen and memories I'd created, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere contentment. I'd faced the worst betrayal imaginable, and not only survived, but thrived. I'd proven to myself and others that age didn't have to mean powerlessness, that love didn't require accepting abuse, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-care is refusing to be a victim. The house on Maple Street remained mine, just as it should be. The garage where they'd planned to exile me had become a workshop where I created beautiful things with my own hands. The rooms they'd criticized as too large and difficult to maintain were filled with friends, activities, and purposes that enriched my daily life. But the most important victory wasn't about property or possessions. It was about the woman I'd become through the process of defending myself. Someone who trusted her own judgment, protected her own interests, and refused to apologize for taking up space in the world. That transformation was worth more than any house, and it could never be taken away from me. The last thought I had before sleep claimed me was gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place of peace and security. David and Jessica. had intended to diminish me, to reduce me to a problem they could solve by removing me from their path. Instead, they'd forced me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and to build a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything I'd experienced before. In trying to destroy me, they'd actually liberated me. In attempting to steal my future, they'd given me the courage to create a better one. In targeting me as a victim, they'd transformed me into a survivor who could help others find their own strength and resilience. The woman who would wake up tomorrow morning in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by her own choices, was living proof that sometimes the most destructive betrayals can become the foundation for the most meaningful victories. And that was a lesson worth sharing with anyone who needed to hear it, for as long as I had breath to tell the story. The morning after my 82nd birthday celebration, I woke to find an envelope that had been slipped under my front door, sometime during the night. There was no postmark, no return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately despite the years that had passed. David had been here, standing on the porch where he'd once played as a child, close enough to touch the door handle of the home he'd tried to steal from me. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, a picture of him with a woman I didn't recognize and two small children, a boy and a girl who looked to be about 5 and 7 years old. On the back, he'd written, "Mom, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know you have grandchildren who would love to meet their grandmother. These are the children Jessica and I never had together. Sarah understands everything that happened, and she thinks you have every right to hate me. But maybe someday, you might want to know Emma and Michael. They live just 2 hours away." I studied the faces in the photograph for a long time. The children had David's eyes and smile, the same features I'd once adored in my son before he'd betrayed everything I thought I knew about his character. The woman, Sarah, looked kind and genuine in a way Jessica never had. She was holding both children close, and there was something protective in her posture that reminded me of myself when David was young. The rational part of my mind immediately recognized this for what it was. Another manipulation attempt, perhaps more subtle than David and Jessica's previous tactics, but manipulation nonetheless. Using innocent children as emotional leverage was exactly the kind of strategy that had nearly worked 10 years ago when he'd exploited my love for him to justify stealing my home. But another part of me, the part that had once been a devoted mother and had always imagined having grandchildren, to spoil and love, felt a familiar ache of longing. These children existed because of choices David had made after his release from prison. They were real people with their own personalities and needs, not responsible for their father's crimes against me. I called Helen to discuss this unexpected development, knowing she would help me think through the implications without judgment. She'd been my anchor throughout the entire ordeal with David and Jessica, and her perspective had become invaluable in navigating complex emotional decisions. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked after I'd described finding the photograph and David's message. "That this could be genuine, but it could also be another scheme," I admitted. "Sarah might really be a good person who has no intention of manipulating me, or she might be part of whatever David's planning now. The children are certainly innocent, but that doesn't mean contact with them would be safe for me." Helen was quiet for a moment. "Maggie, you've built a life that works perfectly for you. You're happy, secure, and surrounded by people who respect and care about you. The question isn't whether David has changed or whether these children deserve to know you. The question is whether opening this door would improve your life or put your peace at risk." Her words crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. The woman I'd become over the past decade had learned to prioritize her own well-being without guilt or apology. Every relationship in my current life was based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Why would I risk disrupting that foundation for people who were essentially strangers, even if they shared my DNA? I decided to do some research before making any decisions. Through careful internet searches and public records, I learned that David had indeed remarried 3 years after his divorce from Jessica was finalized. Sarah appeared to be a social worker with no criminal history and no obvious red flags in her background. The children were from her previous marriage, and David had legally adopted them after their wedding. This information suggested that David's current situation was genuinely different from his life with Jessica. He was apparently functioning as a stepfather to children who needed stability, married to a woman whose profession required integrity and ethical behavior. It was possible that prison and the loss of everything he'd valued had actually changed him in meaningful ways. But possibility wasn't certainty, and I'd learned the hard way that people who were capable of sophisticated fraud and manipulation were also capable of creating convincing facades of rehabilitation. Even if David had genuinely changed, that didn't erase the trauma he'd inflicted on me or create an obligation for me to participate in his redemption story. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about the photograph more than I wanted to admit. The little girl, Emma, had a gap-toothed grin that reminded me of David at that age. The boy, Michael, was holding a soccer ball, and I wondered if he loved sports the way his stepfather had as a child. These thoughts felt dangerous because they created emotional connections to people I'd never met and might never safely meet. I discussed the situation with Dr. Williams during my regular checkup, knowing he'd maintained professional boundaries while also becoming a trusted friend over the years. His perspective as both a medical professional and someone who'd witnessed my transformation was invaluable. "Margaret, you're under no obligation to have a relationship with anyone, regardless of family connections," he said. "The question you need to ask yourself is what you want, not what other people think you should want or what might be best for David or his family." "What I want is to protect the life I've built," I said. "But I also wonder if I'm being too rigid, too unforgiving. These children didn't do anything wrong." Dr. Williams leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "You know what I've observed over the years of treating elderly patients? The ones who maintain their independence. Longest are the ones who trust their instincts and maintain firm boundaries. The patients who get manipulated by family members, who second-guess themselves and prioritize other people's feelings over their own safety, are the ones who end up losing their autonomy." His words reminded me of something I'd learned through my advocacy work. Victims of financial abuse often struggle with guilt about protecting themselves from further exploitation. They worry about appearing heartless or vindictive when they refuse contact with family members who have hurt them. But this guilt can be exactly what predators count on when planning their next approach. I decided to consult with Robert Chen, my attorney, about the legal implications of any contact with David or his family. Though the criminal case was long settled, there might be considerations I hadn't thought of regarding my estate planning or personal safety. "Margaret, from a legal standpoint, you're under no obligation to respond to David's contact or to develop relationships with his stepchildren," Robert confirmed. "However, if you did choose to meet these children, I'd recommend doing so through supervised visits in public places, at least initially. You'd also want to be very clear about boundaries regarding your property and finances." Robert's caution reinforced my own instincts about the potential risks involved. Even if David's intentions were genuine, even if Sarah was truly the ethical person she appeared to be, contact with them would inevitably involve some level of vulnerability on my part. They would learn details about my current life, my routines, my relationships, and my assets that could potentially be used against me later. After much consideration, I decided to write a response to David's letter. Not because I was ready to meet his family, but because I wanted to clearly communicate my position and close this door permanently rather than leave it ajar for future manipulation attempts. "David," I wrote, "I received your photograph and message. While I'm glad to know you've apparently built a stable life with Sarah and her children, my decision about contact remains unchanged. The trust between us was destroyed by your choices 10 years ago, and rebuilding it would require me to make myself vulnerable to people who have already demonstrated their willingness to harm me for personal gain. I don't wish ill for you or your family, but I also don't wish to be part of your life in any way. The children in your photograph deserve to grow up in a stable, loving environment without the complications that my presence would inevitably create. Please respect my decision by not attempting future contact through any means. I've built a life that brings me joy and security, surrounded by people who respect my choices and value my well-being. That life has no room for relationships based on obligation, guilt, or shared genetics, rather than mutual respect and genuine affection. Sending that letter felt like closing the final chapter of a story that had begun with David's birth and should have been one of love and mutual support. Instead, it was a story of betrayal, crime, and the necessity of choosing self-protection over family loyalty. The sadness I felt wasn't for the relationship I was refusing to pursue, but for the one that had been destroyed by his choices years earlier. Within days of mailing my response, I felt a sense of closure that had been missing even after the criminal trial ended. Every loose thread had been tied off, every boundary had been clearly established, every door had been firmly closed. There would be no more wondering about David's motives, no more possibilities for manipulation, no more emotional vulnerability to people who had proven themselves untrustworthy. This decision also clarified something important about the life I'd built since the trial. It wasn't just about maintaining my independence or protecting my property, though those things remained important. It was about creating relationships and experiences that added genuine value to my existence, rather than draining energy through drama, manipulation, or obligation. The friends who celebrated my birthday with me were people I'd chosen based on their character, their kindness, and their respect for my autonomy. The activities that filled my days were pursuits I genuinely enjoyed, rather than duties I felt obligated to perform. The home that David and Jessica had tried to steal had become a sanctuary that reflected my authentic preferences rather than other people's expectations. This authenticity extended to my advocacy work as well. When I spoke to groups about elder abuse prevention, I wasn't performing a role or trying to present myself in a particular light. I was sharing genuine experiences and hard-won wisdom with people who needed to hear that survival and recovery were possible, even after devastating betrayals. The support group I'd helped establish had grown to include more than 30 regular members, all survivors of various forms of elder abuse. We met weekly in the community center, sharing stories, strategies, and encouragement that helped each person continue their journey toward healing and empowerment. Many of these women had faced choices similar to mine about maintaining contact with family members who had exploited them. Some had chosen reconciliation after seeing genuine evidence of change and remorse. Others had maintained complete separation, finding peace in relationships that weren't complicated by past trauma. There was no right answer that worked for everyone. But there was definitely a wrong answer, making decisions based on other people's expectations rather than your own well-being. Through this work, I'd learned that my story was both unique and universal. The specific details of financial fraud and attempted property theft were particular to my situation, but the underlying dynamics of family manipulation, the exploitation of love and trust, and the challenge of protecting yourself from people who were supposed to care for you were common themes in many elderly people's experiences. This recognition had led to some of the most meaningful relationships of my later years. Connecting with other survivors created bonds that went deeper than ordinary friendships, because they were built on shared understanding of profound challenges and mutual respect for the strength required to overcome them. As I approached my 83rd birthday the following year, I realized that my refusal to reconnect with David had been one of the most important decisions of my recovery. It had allowed me to complete the transformation from victim to survivor, to advocate without the distraction and potential sabotage that his presence might have created. The woman I'd become was someone who could make difficult choices without excessive guilt, who could prioritize her own welfare without apology, and who could create meaningful relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or genetics. These were skills that served me well not just in dramatic situations like David's attempted fraud, but in countless smaller decisions about how to spend my time, energy, and resources. Looking back on the entire experience, from the first signs of David and Jessica's manipulation through their criminal trial and beyond, I could see it as a master class in recognizing and responding to threats to personal autonomy. Every challenge they'd presented had taught me something valuable about protecting myself, trusting my instincts, and maintaining boundaries even when doing so was emotionally difficult. The house on Maple Street had become more than just the property they'd tried to steal. It had become a symbol of everything I'd fought to preserve and protect. Every room represented a choice I'd made about how to live my life. Every improvement and decoration reflected my authentic preferences, rather than compromises designed to please other people. But most importantly, the house had become the foundation for a life that was entirely my own creation. The garden where I grew vegetables and flowers brought me daily joy and satisfaction. The workshop where I crafted wooden items combined creativity with practical skill in ways that surprised and delighted me. The library where I read and wrote provided intellectual stimulation and peaceful solitude whenever I needed it. These spaces and activities weren't just ways to pass time in my final years. They were expressions of the person I'd discovered myself to be when freed from the expectations and manipulations of others. They represented the life I might have lived. All along, if I'd learned earlier to trust my own judgment and prioritize my own well-being. As I settled into my favorite reading chair that evening, surrounded by books I'd chosen, in a room I'd decorated, in a house I'd defended and preserved, I felt a profound satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or victory over David and Jessica. It had everything to do with the recognition that I'd created exactly the life I wanted to live, populated with people who respected and valued me, filled with activities that brought me genuine pleasure and purpose. The story that had begun with my son and daughter-in-law trying to move me to the garage had ended with me moving them completely out of my life and discovering that their absence had created space for relationships and experiences far more rewarding than anything we'd ever shared. That transformation was the real victory, and it belonged entirely to me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.